The first account of Henry Caldwell's return comes from a railway clerk in Butte, Montana, dated November 3rd, 1902. The clerk, whose name appears in the station logbook as J. Henriksen, noted the arrival of a man in torn clothing, considerable beard growth, appearing disoriented. What Henriksen remembered most clearly, when interviewed 26 years later, was not Caldwell's appearance but his response to a simple question. I asked him where he'd come from. Henriksen told the historian who tracked him down in 1928. He looked at me like I'd asked him to describe hell itself. Then he just walked away. Henry Caldwell was 31 years old when he stepped off that train. He had departed Butte 6 weeks earlier with 4 other men, surveyors contracted by the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, to map potential claims in the Bitterroot Range. Of those 5 men, only Caldwell returned. The other 4 were never found. Caldwell checked into a boarding house on East Granite Street that same afternoon. The proprietor, Mrs. Adelaide Moss, kept meticulous records. Her ledger shows Caldwell paid for 2 weeks in advance, ate little, and declined all attempts at conversation. When Mrs. Moss asked if he was ill, he told her he was not. When she asked if he needed a doctor, he said he did not. When she asked, gently, what had happened to his companions, Caldwell looked at her for a long moment and said only, "They're gone." He would never say more than that about them. The silence began immediately, and it was absolute. Company officials arrived within the week. There were 3 of them: the expedition coordinator, a company lawyer, and a claims adjuster whose job was to determine whether the missing men's families were entitled to compensation. They met with Caldwell in the boarding house parlor on November 9th. Mrs. Moss, who brought coffee and remained nearby, reported that the meeting lasted no more than 20 minutes. When the men emerged, the lawyer was visibly angry. The coordinator looked pale. The adjuster was writing furiously in a small notebook. "He told us nothing," the coordinator said to Mrs. Moss, not bothering to lower his voice. "Absolutely nothing." The company notes from that meeting, preserved in the Anaconda Mining Company archives, are remarkable for their brevity. Under survivor account, there is only a single line. Subject refuses to provide testimony regarding circumstances of disappearance. Caldwell was not arrested because there was no evidence of wrongdoing. He was not compelled to testify because there was no trial. The 4 men were simply gone, and the 1 man who knew what happened chose to say nothing. In the days that followed, other attempts were made. A reporter from the Butte Miner approached Caldwell on the street and asked if he would tell his story. Caldwell walked past him without acknowledging the question. A minister from the Methodist Church, hoping to offer pastoral care, knocked on Caldwell's door. When he asked if Caldwell wished to unburden his conscience, Caldwell thanked him politely and closed the door. The families of the missing men arrived next. Thomas Rourke's widow came from Helena with her 2 children. She found Caldwell in a cafe and sat down across from him without asking permission. According to the waitress who served them, whose account appears in a 1930 oral history collection, Mrs. Rourke did not shout or accuse. She simply asked Caldwell to tell her what happened to her husband. Caldwell set down his fork. He looked at the woman and her children. The waitress recalled that his hands were shaking. "I can't tell you that," he said. "Can't or won't?" Mrs. Rourke asked. Caldwell stood up, placed money on the table, and left. The distinction between can't and won't would become central to the question of Henry Caldwell's silence. Some who knew him believed he was traumatized beyond the capacity for speech, that whatever he had witnessed had broken something fundamental in him. Others believed the silence was a choice, a deliberate act of concealment. The evidence, such as it exists, suggests both interpretations may be incomplete. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, a physician who examined Caldwell at the insistence of the company's insurance agent, found him to be in fair physical health, despite obvious signs of recent hardship. The examination notes describe healing abrasions on Caldwell's hands and face, weight loss of approximately 15 pounds, and what Whitmore termed extreme reluctance to discuss recent experiences. When Whitmore asked direct questions about the expedition, Caldwell answered with facts that could be verified: dates, locations, weather conditions. When asked what happened to the other men, Caldwell became what Whitmore described as uncommunicative to the point of muteness. Whitmore wrote in his report, "The patient is capable of speech and reason. His refusal to provide account appears volitional rather than pathological. Volitional, an act of will." By the end of November, the official search had been abandoned. The mining company sent a recovery team into the Butte routes, following the route the surveyors were meant to have taken. They found the expedition's base camp, such as it was, a cleared area near a creek, evidence of a fire, some damaged equipment. They found no bodies. They found no signs of violence. They found no indication of what might have caused 4 men to vanish and 1 to return alone. The recovery team's report concluded, further search inadvisable due to approaching winter conditions and lack of credible information regarding location of missing persons. Henry Caldwell, the only credible source of information, continued to say nothing. He took a job as a clerk in a hardware store. He kept to himself. He did not drink, did not socialize, did not attend church. People who worked alongside him in later years described him as competent, quiet, and profoundly alone. When asked about his past, he would say he had been a surveyor. If pressed, he would say nothing more. In 1904, a journalist named Margaret Alverson attempted what she called a sympathetic portrait of Caldwell for a magazine feature on Western tragedies. She spent weeks in Butte, interviewing anyone who had known him before finally approaching Caldwell himself. She found him outside the hardware store at closing time. "I'm not writing about what happened," she told him according to her notes. "I'm writing about silence, about what it means to carry something you can't share." Caldwell looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Then you already know everything I could tell you." He walked away. Alverson's article, published in McClure's magazine in January 1905, does not solve the mystery of what happened in the Butte routes. It does, however, offer a theory about Henry Caldwell's silence. She wrote, "Perhaps there are truths so terrible that speaking them would do more harm than leaving them buried. Perhaps Mr. Caldwell's silence is not the silence of guilt, but the silence of mercy. Whether Caldwell ever read those words is unknown. What is known is this. For the remaining 41 years of his life, Henry Caldwell never told anyone what happened to Thomas Rourke, Edward Finch, Martin Kowalski, or David Brennan. He never wrote it down. He never confessed it to a priest, a doctor, or a friend. If he dreamed about it, he did not say. If he regretted it, he gave no sign. The silence was complete, and it began the moment he stepped off that train. The 5 men who departed Butte on September 19, 1902, were not strangers to one another, though neither were they intimate friends. Their association was professional, born of the particular demands of mineral surveying in the American West at the turn of the century. What mattered was competence, reliability, and the ability to tolerate weeks of isolation in difficult terrain. By those measures, they were well chosen. Henry Caldwell was the youngest and least experienced. He had been surveying for only 3 years, most of it in the relatively forgiving landscape of western Montana valleys. Company records describe him as methodical and detail-oriented, qualities that had earned him a place on larger expeditions despite his junior status. His supervisor's notes from 1901 include the assessment, "Caldwell follows instructions precisely, does not improvise, trustworthy for routine work." It is worth noting that "does not improvise" was considered a virtue. Thomas Rourke, at 43, was the expedition leader. He had spent 2 decades in the mountains, first as a timber cruiser, then as a surveyor for railroad companies and mining concerns. Men who worked with him described Rourke as calm under pressure, decisive, and fair. He had a wife and 2 children in Helena. He wrote letters to them from every expedition, and those letters, preserved by his daughter until her death in 1967, reveal a man who understood the risks of his profession but never dwelt on them. In a letter dated August 1902, Rourke wrote to his wife, "The work is the same as always. The mountains do not change, only our reasons for being in them. There is no anxiety in those words, no premonition. Edward Finch was the expedition's geologist, a position that carried a certain intellectual prestige but required equal parts book learning and practical endurance. At 36, Finch had worked throughout the West, producing surveys that were praised for their accuracy. He kept journals. Though only fragments survive, most were lost with him. One surviving entry from 1900, written during a different expedition, notes, "The beauty of this country is inseparable from its indifference. It does not notice whether we live or die." Martin Kowalski, 39, was the camp manager, responsible for logistics, supplies, and the daily functioning of the expedition. It was unglamorous work, but essential. Kowalski had emigrated from Poland in 1887 and had worked his way west through labor camps, rail gangs, and finally into the more stable employment of survey crews. A fellow surveyor interviewed in 1925 remembered Kowalski as the kind of man who could fix anything and never complained. He had no family that anyone knew of. He sent money to relatives in the old country. David Brennan, the eldest at 47, was what was called a technical hand, an experienced outdoorsman who could navigate, pack mules, and handle the physical demands of mountain travel. Brennan had been doing this work since his 20s. He knew the bitter roots better than any of them. In a reference letter from a previous employer, Brennan is described as unflappable and worth two ordinary men in rough country. These were not reckless men. They were not amateurs. The expedition was well planned. The company provided adequate supplies, quality equipment, and clear objectives. Survey potential copper claims in the southeastern Bitterroots, assess accessibility, and return with maps and ore samples. Timeline, 4 to 6 weeks. Risk assessment, moderate. All 5 men had signed contracts that acknowledged the dangers of mountain work, weather, injury, difficult terrain, but nothing in the planning suggested this expedition was more hazardous than dozens of others conducted each year. The departure was unremarkable. Supplies were loaded onto mules at the company warehouse. Final checks were made. Rourke reviewed the route with company officials one last time. The men departed in good spirits, or at least without incident. A clerk who processed their paperwork later recalled that the men seemed ordinary, just another crew heading out. What survives of their relationships comes from fragmentary sources, company records, letters, second-hand accounts. Rourke and Brennan had worked together before and respected each other's judgment. Finch was friendly with Kowalski, or at least they were often seen talking during the preparatory days in Butte. Caldwell, the youngest, mostly listened. In one of Thomas Rourke's letters to his wife, written a week before departure, he mentions Caldwell briefly. "We have a young fellow on this trip, very earnest, perhaps too serious. I will try to put him at ease." There is no evidence that Caldwell needed putting at ease, but it suggests Rourke noticed him, thought of him, considered him worth mentioning. They were, in other words, men who worked together with the ordinary trust required of such work. Not intimate, but not indifferent. They depended on one another in the way all men in the wilderness must. The last photograph of the 5 men together was taken on September 18th, the day before departure, outside the mining company office. It is a standard expedition photograph. 5 men standing in a line, dressed for the field, unsmiling in the manner of the era. The photograph was developed and filed with the expedition records. It was later reproduced in newspapers when the men went missing. Henry Caldwell stands on the far left. His posture is slightly stiff, his hands at his sides. Rourke stands in the center, taller than the others. Brennan is to Rourke's right, arms crossed. Finch and Kowalski flank the group. They all look directly at the camera. It is an unremarkable photograph of 5 unremarkable men about to do unremarkable work. There is nothing in the image to suggest that 4 of them would disappear within 6 weeks, or that the 5th would spend the rest of his life refusing to explain why. The question of what these men meant to each other, whether there was affection, resentment, rivalry, or simple professional neutrality, cannot be answered definitively. What can be said is that there is no evidence of serious conflict before the expedition. No arguments, no complaints, no warnings. When they left Butte on the morning of September 19th, they were 5 men with a job to do. 6 weeks later, only one of them would be alive, and he would never say what happened to the others. Reconstructing the final days of the expedition requires piecing together fragments, company itineraries, the recovery team's findings, terrain analysis, and the few verifiable facts Henry Caldwell provided when pressed. What emerges is not a complete narrative, but a series of confirmed moments leading up to an absence. The last independent confirmation of all 5 men together comes from a sheepherder named Anton Vasquez, whose account was recorded by the recovery team in November 1902. Vasquez encountered the survey party on October 11th, approximately 3 weeks into their expedition, near a ridge above Sleeping Child Creek. He was moving his flock to lower pasture and shared coffee with the men. Vasquez's description is specific: 5 men, healthy, in good spirits, well supplied. He spoke primarily with Thomas Rourke, who asked about weather patterns and the condition of trails to the south. Vasquez warned them that early snow was possible. He had seen signs, but Rourke thanked him and said they planned to complete their work within 2 weeks. They seemed like they knew what they were doing, Vasquez told the recovery team. No trouble between them that I could see. Vasquez was the last person, other than Henry Caldwell, to see all 5 men alive. After that, there is silence. Not the silence of Caldwell's later refusal, but the silence of the wilderness itself, the vast absence of witnesses. The expedition's intended route took them south and east into increasingly remote terrain. They were to survey 3 specific areas identified by the company's geologists as potentially mineral-rich, then return north to Butte via a different route, completing a rough circuit. The entire journey was expected to cover approximately 200 miles over 4 to 6 weeks. Based on the supplies they carried, the recovery team estimated the men could have remained self-sufficient in the field until at least late October, possibly into early November, if they rationed carefully. When the recovery team reached the expedition's base camp in late November, they found it in a state that suggested recent occupation. The camp was located in a protected hollow near a creek, sheltered by pine and spruce. A fire pit had been dug and lined with stones. Equipment was present but damaged. Surveying instruments found broken, supply crates opened and partially emptied, canvas torn. Some items appeared to have been abandoned hastily. Others were arranged with care, as if someone had tried to organize what remained. No bodies, no blood, no obvious signs of violence. The recovery team's leader, a man named Samuel Croft, who had 20 years of experience in mountain search operations, noted in his report, "Camp appears to have been used for an extended period, then vacated under unclear circumstances. Condition of equipment suggests either accident, severe weather event, or rapid departure. Physical evidence insufficient to determine cause. What they did not find is as significant as what they did. No graves, no indication of burial, no remains of any kind. 4 men had vanished as if they had simply walked away and never come back." The question of when the separation occurred, when Henry Caldwell became separated from the others, or when the others disappeared, cannot be answered with certainty. Caldwell himself, when questioned by company officials and later by Dr. Whitmore, would confirm only the following facts. The expedition proceeded according to plan through mid-October. The men completed survey work at 2 of the 3 intended sites. Weather conditions deteriorated in late October. He became separated from the others. He did not see them again. When asked how he became separated, Caldwell said he could not explain it clearly. When asked where he last saw the others, Caldwell said he did not remember the exact location. When asked why he survived when they did not, Caldwell said nothing at all. The physical evidence of Caldwell's journey back to civilization is sparse but consistent with a man traveling alone under duress. He arrived in Butte with torn clothing, minor injuries consistent with difficult travel, and signs of inadequate nutrition. Dr. Whitmore's examination found no wounds suggesting violence, no indication of frostbite despite late-season conditions, and no signs of illness. Caldwell was exhausted, but he was whole. One detail from the recovery team's report stands out. Among the damaged equipment at the base camp, they found a surveyor's notebook that had belonged to Edward Finch. The entries were technical, unremarkable, measurements, geological observations, sketches of rock formations. The final dated entry was October 23rd. It ends mid-sentence. Further analysis of the northern exposure will require. The sentence is unfinished. The rest of the page is blank. After that, nothing. Whatever happened, it happened after October 23rd. The weather records for the Bitterroot Range in late October 1902 show a significant early-season storm moving through the region between October 24th and October 27th. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow fell at higher elevations. It would have been dangerous but not unprecedented. Men had survived worse, but not these men. When Mrs. Adelaide Moss asked Caldwell months later if the weather had been the cause of the disaster, if his companions had succumbed to cold or injury, he told her, "The weather was hard, but that's not what happened." "Then what did happen?" she asked. Caldwell looked out the window of the boarding house. He did not answer. The recovery team made several attempts to locate the men's remains. They followed drainages, searched likely routes of travel, investigated areas where a man might fall or become trapped. The mountains yielded nothing. In his final report, Samuel Croft wrote, "It is the assessment of this team that the missing men are deceased. Location of remains may not be possible given terrain and seasonal conditions. Further search efforts unlikely to produce results." The case was closed. But for Henry Caldwell, something else was closed as well. Some door in his memory or his conscience that he refused to open. If he knew where the bodies were, he never said. If he had tried to help them, he never described the attempt. If he had made choices in those final days, choices between his survival and theirs, choices that haunted him, he kept those choices to himself. The last confirmed moment of the 5 men together was October 11th, drinking coffee with a sheepherder who warned them about snow. 3 weeks later, 4 of them were gone. And the 5th man, the one who walked out alive, would never explain how or why. The pressure on Henry Caldwell to speak did not relent with time. If anything, it intensified, though the nature of that pressure evolved from official inquiry to something more intimate and more insistent, the weight of unfinished grief. In December 1902, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company formally closed its investigation. Without Caldwell's cooperation, there was no way to determine liability, assign blame, or even establish a clear narrative of what had occurred. The company's legal counsel concluded that the deaths, assuming the men were dead, were most likely the result of natural causes or accident, and that no negligence could be proven. The families of the missing men were offered modest settlements, contingent upon signing releases that waived further claims. 3 of the 4 families signed. Thomas Rourke's widow refused. She hired a lawyer, not to sue the company, but to compel Caldwell to testify under oath. Her attorney, a man named Lawrence Phelps, filed a petition in Montana Territorial Court, arguing that Caldwell possessed information material to the determination of Rourke's death and could not legally refuse to provide it. The petition was denied. The judge ruled that in the absence of a criminal proceeding, there was no basis to compel testimony. Mrs. Rourke did not give up. In January 1903, she wrote to Caldwell directly. The letter was never answered, but a copy survived in her personal papers, preserved by her daughter. It is a restrained, dignified letter, no accusations, no anger, only a request. "Mr. Caldwell, I am writing not to demand anything of you but to ask for what I believe is owed to me as a widow and a mother. My children ask me every day where their father is. I cannot answer them. I tell them he is with God, but they want to know how he died, and whether he suffered, and whether anyone was with him at the end. You were there. You know these things. I do not understand why you will not share them. If my husband wronged you in some way, tell me. If something terrible happened that you believe would harm me to know, I assure you I am stronger than you think. I have buried a child. I have endured much. I can endure the truth. Please, Mr. Caldwell, tell me what happened to my husband." There is no record of a response. Mrs. Rourke tried once more, in person, in February 1903. She arrived at the hardware store where Caldwell worked and waited for him outside. When he emerged at the end of the day, she approached him calmly and asked if they could speak. Caldwell stopped walking. According to a witness, a store clerk who watched from the doorway, they stood facing each other for what seemed like a long time. Then Caldwell said very quietly, "I'm sorry." "Tell me," Mrs. Rourke said. "I can't." "Why?" Caldwell shook his head. He did not elaborate. He walked away and Mrs. Rourke did not follow. She returned to Helena the next day. She never contacted Caldwell again. The weight of her silence, her acceptance of his refusal, may have been heavier than any continued interrogation. Other attempts came from other sources. In 1904, a private investigator hired by Edward Finch's brother arrived in Butte, hoping that financial incentive might succeed where grief had failed. He offered Caldwell $500 for a full account of the expedition. Caldwell declined. The investigator raised the offer to $1,000. Caldwell told him no amount of money would change his answer. "You're protecting someone," the investigator said, according to his own notes. "Yourself or someone else." Caldwell neither confirmed nor denied the accusation. In 1907, a true crime writer from New York traveled to Montana to research what he called the mystery of the Bitterroot Dead. He interviewed dozens of people, reviewed all available documents, and attempted several times to speak with Caldwell. Caldwell refused each time. The writer's book, published in 1909, concludes with a chapter titled "The Man Who Knew," and offers several theories. That Caldwell had murdered his companions, that he had abandoned them to die, that he had survived through cowardice or betrayal. The book sold well. It ruined nothing for Caldwell because his reputation was already ruined. Or rather, it had been replaced entirely by his silence. He was no longer Henry Caldwell, surveyor. He was Henry Caldwell, the man who would not speak. People who worked with him in those years described a kind of performance of normalcy. He arrived at work on time. He fulfilled his duties. He was polite to customers. But there was something missing, some essential quality of presence. One co-worker, interviewed decades later, said, "It was like he was only half there. The other half was somewhere else, and it wasn't anywhere good." Did Caldwell feel guilt? Remorse? Fear? The evidence is indirect, but suggestive. In 1910, Caldwell abruptly left Butte. He moved to Spokane, Washington, took a job in a lumber mill, and lived under an assumed name for nearly 2 years before someone recognized him. When confronted, he did not deny his identity, but he left Spokane shortly after. He moved again in 1913, this time to Oregon, then to Idaho, then back to Montana, but not to Butte, never to Butte. It was a pattern of flight, though from what or whom is unclear. In 1918, during the influenza pandemic, Caldwell contracted the virus. He was living in Missoula at the time, working as a night watchman at a rail yard. He became seriously ill, was hospitalized, and for several days was not expected to survive. A nurse who cared for him later told a local historian that Caldwell, delirious with fever, spoke constantly, fragments of sentences, names, pleas. He kept saying, "I couldn't," over and over, the nurse recalled. "I couldn't. I couldn't." Once he said, "They trusted me." When he recovered, the nurse asked if he remembered what he had said. Caldwell told her he did not. Whether that was true is impossible to know. The most persistent pressure came not from investigators or journalists or grieving families, but from time itself. As the years passed, the question of what happened in the Bitterroots shifted from a matter of legal or moral accountability to something closer to historical record. People wanted to know not because it would change anything, but because the not knowing had become unbearable. In 1925, a young historian named Victor Arneson, researching early mining expeditions for a university thesis, sought out Caldwell in Great Falls, where he was then living. Arneson's approach was different. He did not ask what happened. He asked why Caldwell had chosen not to speak. "Because," Caldwell said, "some things shouldn't be said." "Even after so many years?" Arneson asked. "Especially after so many years." Arneson noted that Caldwell did not seem angry or defensive. He seemed tired. "Do you regret the silence?" Henriksen asked. Caldwell thought about that. Then he said, "No." It was the closest he ever came to explaining himself. By the 1930s, Caldwell was in his 60s, still working, still alone, still silent. The people who had once demanded answers were mostly dead or had given up. The story had faded from public memory, preserved only in archived newspapers and the fading recollections of those who had been there. Henry Caldwell had outlasted the curiosity, but he had not outlasted the silence. It was still with him, intact, impenetrable. In 1942, Caldwell was struck by a car while crossing a street in Kalispell, Montana. He suffered severe injuries and was taken to a hospital, where he lingered for 3 days before dying. A priest was called, as was customary. The priest later reported that Caldwell was conscious and coherent in his final hours. I asked if there was anything he wanted to confess. The priest said, "He told me there was not." "Did you press him?" the priest was asked. No. It was clear he had made his peace, whatever that peace was. Henry Caldwell died on April 17, 1943, at the age of 71. He was buried in a municipal cemetery in Kalispell. The grave marker lists his name and dates, nothing more. If he left any written account, letters, journals, a deathbed confession, none has ever been found. The silence he carried for 41 years went with him to the grave. What remains when the voices are gone is the work of reconstruction, the historian's task of assembling fragments into something that approaches but never becomes a complete picture. The story of Henry Caldwell and the 4 men who disappeared in the Bitterroot Range in 1902 is, in this sense, an archival problem. The materials are scattered, incomplete, and filtered through the limitations of memory, bias, and time. But it is also a moral problem, because the one question that every researcher returns to, the question that haunts every attempt to make sense of what happened, is this: what did Henry Caldwell protect by remaining silent? There are, broadly, 3 categories of interpretation. The first holds that Caldwell was guilty of something, that the silence was concealment. This interpretation, popular in the immediate aftermath and revived periodically by true crime writers, suggests that Caldwell caused or contributed to the deaths of his companions and refused to speak out of self-preservation. Variants of this theory propose murder, negligence, or abandonment. The lack of physical evidence is explained by the remoteness of the location and the passage of time. The refusal to confess is explained by fear of legal or social consequences. The problem with this interpretation is that it does not account for Caldwell's behavior. Guilty men often speak. They lie. They fabricate. They construct alibis. Caldwell did none of these things. He did not deny. He did not deflect. He simply refused to engage with the question at all. That is not the pattern of a man managing a guilty conscience. It is the pattern of something else. The second interpretation is trauma, that Caldwell witnessed something so terrible that he could not speak of it even decades later. This view, more sympathetic, suggests that the silence was pathological rather than volitional, the result of psychological injury. Perhaps he saw his companions die horribly. Perhaps he was forced to make impossible choices. Perhaps the guilt of survival was so overwhelming that speech became impossible. This interpretation is compelling, but it too has weaknesses. Dr. Whitmore's examination found Caldwell capable of speech and reason. Witnesses over the years noted that Caldwell could discuss other aspects of his life without difficulty. His silence was specific, targeted at the events of October 1902 and nothing else. That suggests control, not incapacity. The third interpretation, the one this historian finds most persuasive, is that the silence was a deliberate act of protection, not of himself, but of others. Consider what is known. Caldwell never denied that something terrible happened. He acknowledged in his few statements that the men were gone, that the weather was hard, that he became separated from them. He did not claim they were alive. He did not offer false hope. He did not lie. What he refused to do was describe how they died. Why would the manner of death be more important to conceal than the fact of death itself? One possibility, because the truth would have harmed those left behind more than the mystery did. There are deaths that offer no comfort, deaths that are meaningless or brutal, or the result of choices that seem in retrospect cowardly or selfish. There are deaths that, if fully known, would taint memory rather than preserve it. What if Caldwell witnessed something that would have destroyed how the families remembered their husbands, fathers, brothers? What if the men died in a way that revealed weakness, or fear, or betrayal of one another? In 1928, Margaret Alverson, the journalist who interviewed people in Butte for her 1905 article, was herself interviewed by a graduate student studying Western journalism. She was asked if she still believed Caldwell's silence was merciful. "I do," she said. "I think he knew that some truth caused more pain than ignorance, and I think he loved those men enough, or respected them enough, to let them be remembered as they were, not as they died." "Do you think he was right to do that?" the student asked. Alverson paused. "I don't know, but I think he believed he was." The question of whether Caldwell's silence was justified cannot be answered definitively, because justification depends on knowledge we do not have. What can be said is that the silence was consistent. It did not waver, it did not crack. For 41 years, through pressure, grief, financial incentive, public shaming, deathbed confession, through all of it, Caldwell held. That kind of silence requires strength. It also requires certainty. Whatever Caldwell knew, he was certain it should not be spoken, not to officials, not to families, not to priests or historians or the passage of time. The secret, if there was a secret, was his to keep, and he kept it absolutely. In the archives of the Montana Historical Society, there is a folder labeled Bitterroot Survey Expedition 1902. It contains the company correspondence, recovery team reports, newspaper clippings, and a few personal letters from the families of the missing men. At the bottom of the folder, there is a photograph, the one taken outside the mining company office on September 18, 1902. 5 men standing in a line. Someone at some point wrote on the back of the photograph, "Only one survived." That is true, but incomplete. A more accurate inscription might read, "Only one survived, and he chose never to tell what happened." The distinction matters, because the silence was not an absence. It was a presence, something Caldwell carried with him every day, a weight he never set down. It shaped his life. It drove him from place to place. It isolated him. It defined him. And in the end, it outlasted him. There are no living witnesses now. The families are gone. The landscape has changed. The story exists only in fragments, in archives, in the fading memory of those who heard it secondhand. But the silence remains. It is perhaps the only thing about Henry Caldwell that was ever truly his. What happened in the Bitterroot Range in late October 1902 will never be known with certainty. 4 men vanished. 1 man returned. He refused to explain why. Theories will continue to circulate. Researchers will continue to speculate. But barring the discovery of some hidden document, a letter, a confession, a journal entry that somehow escaped destruction, the truth died with Henry Caldwell on April 17, 1943. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the silence was the answer. Maybe what Caldwell protected in the end was not himself or the men who died, but something more fragile. The possibility that some questions should remain unanswered, some doors should stay closed, some truths should be buried with the dead. The historian's job is to seek truth, but the historian must also acknowledge the limits of that seeking. Henry Caldwell drew a line. On one side, the world, with its demands for answers, its need to know, its insistence that nothing be hidden. On the other side, whatever he saw, whatever he knew, whatever burden he carried, he chose the burden, and he never, not once, explained why. The silence, in the end, is all we have, and perhaps it is enough.